He never once recalled my birthday. This year, however, he sneaked away at midnight, and I went with him. He was crying outside the house where I grew up. Tell us where you're viewing from in the comments section before we begin. For more impactful tales, remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can call me Dahlia Harper. For 38 years, I have been married to the same man. We've buried both of our parents together, raised 2 kids, endured financial hardships, and escaped cancer scares. We were once described as the epitome of endurance, quiet love that sticks out. And I believed them for a long time. On the evening of my 62nd birthday this year, however, something happened that I could never have predicted. It started shortly after midnight, a time most people think of when leftover balloons and cake crumbs are present. Not me. That night, I had gone to bed early. There were no texts or phone calls from my son or daughter, and as usual, my husband Gerald said nothing. His words had not been happy birthday, hadn't even acknowledged me by looking in my way. It should have come naturally to me. For the last 15 birthdays, he had also forgotten. Not 50, 60, or 61, not even the big ones. But each year, a small part of me continued to hope and wait. I believed that I had come to terms with the quiet. Then, however, an odd event occurred. I heard the side door creak open at about 12:30. I can hear things creaking because I live in a quiet house in a quiet area of Minnesota. Gerald was putting on his coat, which he seldom wears unless he's heading somewhere important, when I peered out the window. I watched from behind the curtain, but he didn't notice me. He simply got into the vehicle and headed out into the night. He hadn't spoken, hadn't left a letter. I stood motionless for a moment. Subsequently, an unknown flame erupted within me. I picked up my keys, put on my robe, and went after him. I had no idea where I was heading, just followed the taillights down winding roads I hadn't driven in years, roads that led to neighborhoods that once held echoes of my childhood. It was cold, the kind of cold that bites your fingertips, even inside a heated car. My hands were trembling, not from the weather, but from everything I didn't understand. Why now? Why tonight? I followed him for 20 minutes, heart thumping with every turn. And then I saw it. He pulled over on Elm Street, the street where I grew up, parked in front of a 2-story blue house with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. My childhood home, a place I hadn't visited in decades. The sight of it knocked the wind out of me. I stayed in the car, engine off, lights dimmed. I watched him sit on the curb, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. Then I saw his shoulders heave, and that's when I realized he was crying. Gerald, my husband, the man who hadn't shown a single emotion in over a decade, the man who forgot every birthday, every anniversary, every little moment that mattered to me, was now sitting outside the house I grew up in, sobbing like a child. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched. There was something hollow and haunting about it, like witnessing a ghost break down, like watching a locked door slowly fall off its hinges from the inside. I didn't know whether to run to him or stay hidden. I felt like I had walked into a room I was never supposed to see, like I was witnessing a truth that had been carefully hidden away for years and, once uncovered, could never be repacked neatly. This wasn't about forgetting my birthday. It never was. He remembered. He remembered everything. I sat there, staring at the man I thought I knew, unraveling in front of a house I hadn't stepped inside since I was 6 years old. And suddenly, I realized this wasn't his first time here. He had been carrying something I didn't know about, something tied to me, to my past. That was the moment everything began to change, not just for me, but for us, for everything I thought was buried, for everything I thought I had let go. It turns out the truth had been waiting for me right there on that curb for 38 years. And now I was ready to face it. Before everything unraveled, before the silence between us became a chasm too wide to cross, there was something that felt like love. Maybe not the kind you read about in novels or see in movies, no grand gestures or poetic declarations, but something quieter, something steady, a shared life stitched together by routines and responsibilities. Gerald and I met when I was 24, fresh out of art school and working part-time at a community center. He was 30 and already managing inventory at a construction supply company. He wasn't charming in the traditional sense, but he was reliable, clean-cut, responsible, polite, the kind of man you didn't expect fireworks from, but who always showed up when it mattered. Or at least that's what I thought back then. We married within a year. I wore my mother's wedding dress, a simple lace gown that had yellowed slightly with age, but still made me feel like I was stepping into something sacred. Gerald didn't cry when I walked down the aisle. He didn't say anything special during our vows, but when I looked at him, I saw calm in his eyes, and at the time, I mistook that for devotion. In the early years, he did the small things that I told myself were signs of care. He'd fix the wobbly kitchen chair before I even asked. He'd scrape the frost off my car windows before heading to work on winter mornings. On the weekends, we'd grocery shop together, and he'd always remember which brand of tea I liked. He wasn't affectionate, not physically. No lingering hugs, no kisses on the forehead, but he never raised his voice either. No tempers, no sharp words. I grew up in a home full of shouting and slammed doors, so his quiet felt safe, peaceful, familiar in its predictability. We had our first child, Max, 2 years into the marriage. He came out quiet like his father, always observing, never loud. Then Lena came along 4 years later, all curls and questions and laughter. I stayed home for a while to raise them, putting my art on hold. Gerald never objected. He paid the bills. He was a good provider. And I convinced myself that was enough. I told myself I didn't need much. I celebrated my birthday with the kids, with homemade cards and burnt pancakes in bed. I didn't expect flowers or surprises from Gerald. He wasn't wired that way. He was practical, not emotional. I made excuses. Year after year, it became a habit, almost a ritual, to lower my expectations until there was nothing left to lower. Still, in those early years, we functioned like a team. He would mow the lawn while I painted in the garage, pretending to be working on pieces for a future exhibit. We took the kids to Sunday pancake breakfasts at a local diner. We'd sit in the same booth every time, order the same meals, and smile when the waitress brought extra whipped cream for Lena. It was quiet, predictable, structured. We never had passionate arguments or dramatic reconciliations. We didn't have the kind of love that made your chest ache. But we had something that seemed to hold us together. Looking back now, I wonder how much of that was real and how much was just habit disguised as harmony. The truth is, I built my life around the things he didn't say. I interpreted his silence as contentment. I gave meaning to his stillness. I filled in the blanks with my own love and loyalty. I worked overtime to make our house a home. Cooked his favorite meals, packed his lunch for work every day, even after the kids had grown up and moved out. I celebrated his birthday every year, even when he told me not to fuss. I fussed anyway, not for him, but to convince myself there was still something worth celebrating. I didn't see the cracks forming, not right away. I chalked up his distance to stress, his silence to fatigue. I thought love was supposed to evolve into companionship, less about romance, more about routine. I told myself that if I just kept being steady, kept loving quietly, it would be enough. But somewhere along the way, something shifted, not overnight, but gradually, like sand slipping through your fingers. The warmth faded. The gesture stopped. He stopped asking me how my day was. He'd eat dinner without looking up from the television. Conversations became one-word exchanges. I started talking more to the walls than to my own husband, but I still clung to the life we had built. I held on to the memories, the routines, the quiet smiles that had once passed between us. I told myself it was just a phase, that after all these years, some fading was normal. What I didn't realize, what I refused to admit, was that I had mistaken stillness for stability, that the silence I once found comforting had grown into a void that neither of us was brave enough to confront. And it would take a forgotten birthday, a midnight drive, and the unraveling of a long-buried secret to finally wake me up. The first time I truly felt the sting, the kind that lodges deep in your chest and stays there, was on my 50th birthday. It was supposed to be special. Half a century of living, of surviving, of raising 2 children, building a life from scratch, holding together a marriage with thread and quiet hope. I hadn't expected much, not diamonds or candlelit dinners, just acknowledgement. Just for Gerald to look at me and say, "I'm glad you were born." That's all. That morning started like any other. Gerald got up before me, shuffled into the kitchen, and brewed his usual pot of black coffee. He didn't say a word when I came downstairs. No card, no smile, just a grunt when I offered him toast. I thought, maybe he's planning something for later. I waited. I spent the day baking a cake. Chocolate with cream cheese frosting, my favorite. I told myself I just enjoyed baking, that I didn't need anyone else to do it for me. I set the dining table for two, lit a candle, and placed the cake in the center with a single rose from the garden. 6 o'clock came. Gerald walked through the door, hung up his coat, and went straight to the recliner. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, heart pounding. He didn't look at the table, didn't ask what the occasion was, just turned on the TV and started watching the news. I waited for him to say it. "Happy birthday, Dalia." Instead, he shouted over the TV, "What's for dinner?" I froze. My throat tightened, but I smiled anyway. "I made your favorite, meatloaf, and I baked a cake," I said. He grunted again, eyes glued to the screen. We ate in silence, not even a passing comment about the cake, which I decorated with tiny sugar violets just to give it some life. The candle burned all the way down to a stub before I finally blew it out myself. Later that evening, when I couldn't bear the silence anymore, I said it aloud. "You forgot my birthday?" Gerald blinked, like I'd interrupted a commercial. "Your birthday?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. I nodded slowly. "Today I turned 50. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You always said birthdays weren't a big deal to you." I didn't know what to say. Yes, I had said that, but not because I meant it, because I had to, because if I didn't downplay my own needs, I'd spend every year heartbroken. He added, "I don't see why we have to make a fuss about numbers." A fuss. I sat on the edge of the couch, numb. This wasn't just about a forgotten cake. It was about being invisible, about giving everything to a person who didn't even know when I was born. That night, as he snored beside me in bed, I lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The air felt different, heavier. Something inside me had shifted, just slightly, like a door that had been quietly unlatched. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that I was being sensitive, that he didn't mean to hurt me. But that moment stayed with me. It sank into my bones. And in the days that followed, I noticed other little things, like how he never asked me how my art was going anymore. How he didn't seem to notice when I had a cold. How we could go an entire weekend without touching, without even brushing hands in the hallway. I told myself it was just the way long marriages were, that love changed over time. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered, "This isn't love changing. This is love fading." I didn't tell anyone. Not Max, who lived 2 towns over with his quiet wife and their 2 kids. Not Lena, who called when she remembered and often ended the call with, "You and Dad still doing the same old boring stuff?" I laughed along. I didn't want them to worry. I didn't want anyone to know how hollow things had become. I kept wearing the same smile, making the same meatloaf, pretending everything was fine. But I never forgot that birthday. Not because it marked a new decade, but because it marked the moment I realized something was deeply wrong. I had become someone easy to forget. And once you feel that, truly feel that, something inside you changes forever. That was the first red flag, the first crack in the foundation I thought would hold forever. And I stepped over it, pretending it wasn't there. But the truth is, once you spot the first crack, it's only a matter of time before everything begins to crumble. After that birthday, something subtle but irreversible began to take shape between us, not with a loud fight or a slammed door, but in the space between words left unsaid. I kept moving, kept doing, kept pretending. But inside, I was shrinking. What changed wasn't just Gerald, it was me. I stopped expecting anything. That small voice inside that used to whisper, "Maybe next time," went quiet completely. I adjusted to being invisible without even realizing it. That was the most dangerous part, not the hurt, the numbness. At first, I tried harder. I told myself maybe I had pulled away, maybe I had become too self-contained. I made his favorite dinners more often. I asked about his day, even when mine had been hollow and gray. I laughed politely at his dry humor during the evening news. I even started ironing his shirts again, just like I did when we were first married. He never noticed, or if he did, he never said. Eventually, I stopped trying altogether. I'd wake up, make my tea, and sit in silence while Gerald scrolled through headlines on his phone. Every once in a while, I'd try to make small talk. Lena called yesterday. She's thinking of coming home for the holidays. He would nod, still staring at the screen. Nice. That was it, nice. When Lena actually did visit, He sat quietly at dinner while she asked about my paintings, my health, how the garden was doing. She tried to joke with her father, tried to spark something between us, but the air around him was thick with disinterest. She gave me a long look as she packed up to leave. "You okay, Mom?" I smiled. "Of course. I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired." But I wasn't just tired, I was drained. There's a kind of fatigue that doesn't go away with sleep, the exhaustion of being emotionally abandoned by someone still sitting next to you every night. The things Gerald stopped noticing began to stack up like tiny gravestones. He didn't comment when I got a new haircut, didn't flinch when I stopped wearing perfume, didn't ask why I stopped setting the table for two, didn't wonder where I went when I started taking long walks in the evenings. Once, I was out longer than usual, got caught in a sudden downpour, and came home soaking wet, shivering, shoes squishing with every step. Gerald looked up from the couch, mildly startled, and said, "You left your umbrella." Then he turned back to the TV. I stood in the hallway, dripping onto the floor, my arms wrapped around myself. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I just felt blank. It was like living in a house with a ghost who refused to haunt you, who just existed, silently draining the color from every room. And somehow, we both pretended that was normal. I started talking to myself out loud, sometimes just to hear another voice in the house. I'd narrate what I was doing in the kitchen, comment on a commercial, whisper little jokes under my breath. Gerald never responded. I could have disappeared into the wallpaper, and he wouldn't have noticed. We weren't fighting. There was no obvious abuse, nothing to point to if someone asked, "What's wrong?" That's the thing about emotional neglect. It doesn't leave bruises. It leaves questions, doubt, shame. Was I too needy, too sensitive? Was I imagining it all? I turned inward. I picked up my paintbrush again, but the canvases stayed blank. I'd sit in my studio, brush in hand, waiting for something. Inspiration, emotion, anything. But there was just silence, not outside, inside. It was like I'd forgotten how to feel. Max came to visit once during that time with his two boys. They ran through the living room, filling it with laughter and chaos. Gerald barely looked up from his recliner. I watched him watch the screen and felt something sharp twist in my chest. Our grandchildren were growing up. Our daughter was building a life far away. And the man I once thought I'd grow old with was already emotionally gone. There was no single explosion, no dramatic goodbye, just erosion, slow, relentless, like water carving away at stone. And somehow, even though I was still here, still cooking and cleaning and folding his laundry, I was vanishing a little more each day. That's the part no one tells you about emotional neglect, how invisible you become, even to yourself. And when you forget how to see yourself, it becomes nearly impossible to believe anyone else ever will. It was a Friday evening when the final crack widened, a small gathering at our friends Evelyn and Robert's house, the kind of casual dinner party we'd been attending for decades. Same faces, same potluck-style dishes, same stories dusted off and retold like they were family heirlooms. We'd all grown older together. The same couples who used to host birthday parties for our kids were now swapping blood pressure medication stories and bragging about grandkids. That night, the living room was warm, soft jazz playing in the background, a few too many wine bottles open on the kitchen counter. I wore a light blue cardigan and a necklace Gerald had bought me back in our second year of marriage, back when gifts still happened. I wore it like a memory, draped around my collarbone. We were all gathered in a loose circle around the coffee table, laughing about something Robert had said, when Evelyn turned to me and smiled. "Dahlia, your birthday's coming up, isn't it?" "Big 63. I nodded. "Monday." "Oh, how lovely," she said. "Gerald, what are you doing for her this year? A surprise trip? A romantic dinner? Something sparkly?" It was such a harmless, playful question, the kind you'd expect a husband to meet with a sheepish grin or a teasing. Can't ruin the surprise. Something light, something sweet. But Gerald chuckled, not in a warm, affectionate way, but dry, dismissive. He waved his hand like he was swatting away a fly. "Dahlia's never been into birthdays. She doesn't like that sentimental nonsense." Everyone laughed. Not a mean-spirited laugh, more like the polite, kind people give when they don't know what else to do. I felt every pair of eyes flick to me for a half second. And in that half second, I felt naked, like the truth of our marriage had been accidentally laid bare in the middle of someone else's living room. I tried to smile, but my mouth felt stiff. Inside, something dropped, not like a crash, more like a quiet thud in the dark, the sound of something precious falling and landing in a place it could never be retrieved from. I excused myself and went into the kitchen under the pretense of needing more wine. My hands trembled as I poured. I stared out the window into Evelyn's backyard, into the night, into nothing, the kind of blank, starless dark that swallows you whole. That wasn't just forgetfulness. That wasn't a man who missed a date or skipped a dinner. That was my husband telling a room full of people that I wasn't worth remembering, that I didn't need or want to be celebrated, that my emotions, my desire to feel seen, appreciated, valued, were sentimental nonsense. I couldn't even blame him entirely. I had spent years downplaying my own needs so I wouldn't be disappointed. I had trained him in a way to think I didn't care. I had laughed it off year after year, but hearing him say it out loud in front of others made it real, final, public. When I came back to the group, no one said anything. The conversation had moved on. Gerald was recounting an old fishing story. I sat beside him, legs crossed, hands folded in my lap, face neutral, the mask back in place. On the drive home, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't new. It was just heavier now, tighter. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, humming under his breath. When we pulled into the driveway, I stepped out without waiting for him to turn off the engine. I went straight to the bedroom, took off the necklace, and placed it gently in the back of my drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. Because in that moment, I realized something. Humiliation doesn't always come in shouts or slurs. Sometimes it arrives softly, cloaked in laughter disguised as a joke. And when it comes from the person you once trusted most, it doesn't echo. It implodes quietly and thoroughly. That was the night something in me began to harden, not in anger and clarity. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't overthinking. I wasn't too sensitive. I was being erased, piece by piece, while the world looked on and laughed politely. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet promise began to form. This would be the last time I sat through that kind of silence, because even if no one else was going to protect my dignity, I would. After that night at Evelyn and Robert's, something inside me quietly unraveled. I didn't scream or demand answers. I didn't pack my bags or threaten to leave. That's not how my heart works. I don't explode, I drift. And that's exactly what I began to do. For the next few days, Gerald acted like nothing happened. He didn't notice the way I stopped speaking unless spoken to. He didn't ask why I went to bed early without saying goodnight. When I started sleeping in the guest room, claiming his snoring had gotten worse, he didn't question it. He just nodded, like I told him I was going to pick up milk. It was almost insulting how easy it was to disappear in my own home. I didn't stop everything all at once. I was methodical. I stopped folding his laundry first. Then I stopped pouring his morning coffee. I started cooking smaller meals, just enough for one. When he noticed and asked, "Is this all?" I simply said, "I wasn't sure you'd be home." Even though he always was, he just shrugged and ate in silence. I stopped waiting for the door to open at 5:15 sharp every evening. I stopped making the couch feel like a welcome mat. I stopped pretending the space between us was just a phase. I let it grow like a canyon and watched how easily he adapted to the emptiness. I told myself I wasn't leaving. I was just taking a break from pretending. But even that break began to feel like a quiet departure. I started going on walks alone after dinner, long ones. I'd wander into neighborhoods I hadn't visited in years, ones with little picket fences and cracked sidewalks and kids on bikes. I'd stare into lit-up windows and imagine the families inside, playing games, eating birthday cake, arguing about curfews, all things loud and messy and full of life. My house, by contrast, felt like a museum, everything polished, preserved, and painfully still. Max called occasionally. Lena sent texts more than she called. "Love you, Mom," she'd write, often followed by a heart or a sun emoji. I appreciated them, but I didn't feel like telling either of them the truth. How could I explain that I wasn't lonely because I was alone? I was lonely because I was married to someone who didn't even look up when I walked into a room. One night, I came home late from one of my walks and found Gerald asleep in his chair, the television flickering in the dark. For a moment, I just stood there and stared at him. He looked so peaceful, detached, like he didn't even know he'd lost me already. And maybe that's what broke me. Not the neglect, not the humiliation, not even the silence, but the realization that I could vanish entirely and he wouldn't feel it. I sat on the edge of the guest bed that night and opened an old shoebox full of photographs. Gerald and I at our wedding, young, unsure, hopeful, me holding baby Max, tired and smiling. Lena on Gerald's shoulders at a beach we couldn't even afford but went to anyway. I looked at those moments like they belonged to someone else. I didn't cradle his excuses like I always did. I sat with my pain instead, and that was new, that was powerful. I didn't confront him that morning. I didn't mention the letter. I didn't rush into action or throw it in his face. Something deeper than revenge was stirring, something older and more sacred. I wanted to sit with it a little longer, to understand what it was telling me. Instead, I pulled out my sketchbook. It had dust on the cover. I hadn't opened it in months, years maybe. I wiped it clean with the sleeve of my sweater and took it outside to the back porch, where the light was soft and kind. I began to draw, not a person, not a landscape, just movement, emotion, a swirl of lines that captured the mess inside my chest, the weight of grief and clarity and power all tangled together. It didn't matter if it was beautiful, it only mattered that it was mine. Later that afternoon, I opened a storage box in the garage labeled Dahlia's old stuff. I hadn't looked through it since the kids moved out. Inside were old photographs, a few worn journals, and my adoption papers. I held them up beside the letter from my mother, comparing dates, places, names, it all lined up. There was no doubt. I was the girl my mother wrote about, and Gerald had known. What struck me most wasn't just the betrayal, it was how different I suddenly felt. I had lived my whole life feeling like I was stitched into someone else's story, trying not to disturb the plot. But now I was beginning to see the threads of my own narrative, one that began before Gerald, before our children, even before the Harper name. I wasn't just a wife, I wasn't just a mother, I was someone's daughter, someone's hope, someone's secret. And I was done being silent about who I was. That night, when Gerald sat across from me at dinner, I watched him carefully. He chewed methodically, not noticing the way I stared. He talked about the news, the neighbor's dog, the price of gas, all the usual things. But I wasn't listening. I was studying a man who had once felt like my whole life and now felt like a locked drawer I had finally opened. And I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel lost. I felt something stir in my gut, a flicker of fire, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. I didn't need him to validate me anymore. I didn't need him to tell the truth, because I had finally found it myself. And with that truth came the beginning of something beautiful, my return. After the discovery, I didn't scream. I didn't throw the letter in Gerald's face or demand an explanation. I didn't even bring it up. That surprised me. The old me would have folded under the weight of that secret, desperate for answers, desperate to understand. But the woman sitting in silence across the dinner table that week was someone else entirely, someone stronger, someone awakening. I realized quickly this wasn't the moment to confront, this was the moment to prepare. Everything I had ever relied on, the rhythm of our life, the illusion of security, the quiet routines, had already fallen apart long ago. But now I saw it for what it was, and once you see the cracks clearly, you don't unsee them. You step back, and you start laying bricks elsewhere. The setup didn't begin with lawyers or money or documents. It began with remembering who I was and what I had sacrificed. I returned to my art, not tentatively like before, but with fire. I unearthed the canvases I had stored away in the attic, wiped off the dust, and set them back on their easels. The paint was dry in most of the tubes, so I drove to the local craft store and bought fresh ones, vibrant reds, stormy grays, sun-warmed yellows, colors I hadn't touched in years. The cashier asked if I was teaching a class. I smiled and said, "No, I'm reclaiming a life." Every morning after Gerald left for work, I painted. Some days, I painted what I remembered of my mother. Soft eyes, freckled hands, the shape of her shoulders. Other days, I painted versions of myself, broken open and reborn. No more neat still lives or decorative florals. I painted what I felt, and it spilled out in angry, beautiful color. I started journaling again, too. Not like I did in my 20s, writing for someone else to maybe one day read. This was just for me, My voice on the page, raw and direct. I documented everything. My memories, the letter, the emotion it stirred, the silence in my home, the loneliness I had swallowed for decades, the things Gerald had said, the things he didn't. And slowly, I began making decisions. I researched local art galleries. I booked an appointment at a hair salon and told the stylist I wanted a cut that didn't apologize. I opened a separate bank account, quietly online, and began funneling small bits of money from my monthly allowance and birthday cash from Lena. Nothing big, nothing loud, just enough to feel like I had options, power. I sorted through our joint paperwork, insurance policies, the deed to the house, savings bonds. I photographed documents with my phone and stored them in a hidden folder on my laptop. It wasn't a betrayal, it was protection. And I told no one, not even Lena, because this part of my life wasn't for them to carry. This was for me, a private uprising. The odd part was Gerald never noticed. He was so absorbed in his own world, his routine, his comforts, that my transformation seemed invisible to him. Or maybe in some way, he sensed it and didn't want to ask. Maybe deep down, he knew the ground beneath us was shifting, and he was too afraid to test it. One night, I came to bed late, smelling of paint thinner and lavender lotion. Gerald stirred, half asleep, and murmured, "You're always in that studio now." I didn't respond. I just climbed into bed and faced the other way. Let him wonder. Let the silence speak for once. That was the beauty of the silent setup. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about striking back. It was about rising steadily, privately, without permission or announcement. It was about learning that power doesn't always need to roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it moves in the smallest actions. A signature here, a phone call there, a locked box moved from the closet to the car trunk. Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is rebuild herself without making a sound. And that's what I did. While Gerald poured his morning coffee, I was mapping out my escape in the margins of a grocery list. While he sat on the porch reading the sports page, I was emailing art buyers. While he drifted off in front of the television, I was quietly, beautifully waking up. He thought he still knew me, but he was looking at a shadow. The real me, the woman he'd buried under years of silence, had already started walking toward the door. And this time, I wasn't asking if I could leave, I was deciding when. There's something fascinating about quiet power. It doesn't come with fanfare or fury. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It slips in like a slow tide. And by the time anyone notices, the entire shoreline has changed. That's what began happening in our house. A slow, deliberate shift, invisible to most, but undeniable to me. It began with the smallest thing. I stopped asking for things, not out of pride, out of clarity. When Gerald forgot to refill the gas tank after using my car, I didn't remind him. I filled it myself and didn't mention it. When he left his dirty socks in the living room, I didn't collect them like I used to. I left them there. When he asked what was for dinner, I said, "I haven't decided," and then went out and got myself takeout just for me. He stared at the empty kitchen counter like something was missing. Something was me. He didn't say anything that night, but I caught him looking at me longer than usual as I ate Thai food in front of the fireplace, legs tucked under me, chopsticks in hand. I didn't offer him any. He didn't ask. I didn't mean to be cruel. This wasn't spite. This was detachment, the kind that doesn't come from anger, but from finally understanding your own value. And the more I pulled away, the more uncertain he became. He started asking questions again, small ones. "Where are you going?" When I grabbed my keys in the afternoon. "Did you already eat?" When he walked into the kitchen too late. "Are you okay?" When he found me sitting on the back porch at dusk, sketching in silence. I gave him soft, simple answers. Just out, "Yes, I'm fine." Because the truth was, I was finally starting to feel fine. Maybe even better than fine. I had begun selling some of my artwork. Nothing extravagant. A few pieces through a local gallery, one through an online shop. It wasn't about the money. It was about the proof that my voice, my hands, my vision still mattered, that the parts of me Gerald had overlooked for decades were still alive, still capable of stirring something in someone. The day the first painting sold, I didn't tell him. I just smiled to myself and marked the moment in my journal with a single line. She sees herself again. Around that time, Lena called. She said she'd been thinking of visiting. Something in my voice must have changed. She said I sounded lighter. I told her I was working on new pieces. Real ones, I said, ones that speak. She paused, then said, I want to see them. Even Max, who rarely asked about anything outside of weather and weekend plans, commented on the paintings when he visited with his boys. Wow, Mom, he said, standing in the garage-turned-studio. These are different. I smiled. So am I. The boys ran through the backyard, shouting and tumbling, while Gerald stood on the porch, watching quietly. I could tell something in him was stirring, maybe discomfort, maybe confusion. He was starting to feel the shift, too. It was in the way he hesitated before speaking, in the way he watched me like he was trying to remember who I used to be or understand who I'd become. One evening, he came home with groceries, unprompted, the first time in years he had done that. I opened the bag and found a container of my favorite yogurt, the kind I hadn't bought in ages. He didn't say anything about it, just handed me the bag and started unloading the rest. Thank you, I said. He paused. I noticed we were out. That was all, but the silence between us had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore, it wasn't cold. It was cautious, like he was waiting for something, like he could feel his grip loosening, not just on me, but on the version of our life he had grown comfortable in. And I didn't rush to reassure him, because it wasn't my job to shrink anymore. I had spent so long making myself small enough to fit inside his world, smoothing out my edges, quieting my voice, hiding my brilliance so he wouldn't feel overshadowed. But now I was expanding, reclaiming the space I had earned, and he felt it. He didn't know what I was planning, that I had been making quiet arrangements, carving out a future without him at its center. He didn't know I had already chosen a date, circled it on the back page of my journal, the day I would confront the truth in him, but he could sense something. The air was different. The power had shifted, and for once in our long, tired marriage, he was no longer the one in control. It happened on a Wednesday, the date I had circled in the back of my journal, the one I had chosen not because of some grand meaning, but because it was the first day in months when I woke up and didn't feel afraid, not afraid of his reaction, not afraid of what it would mean for my life, not even afraid of what I would say. I was simply ready. That morning, I brewed coffee for both of us, something I hadn't done in a while. Gerald blinked in surprise when I slid his mug across the table. Thanks, he said cautiously. I didn't reply. I just sat across from him, both hands wrapped around my own cup, watching the steam rise like smoke from something about to burn. I want to talk, I said. He nodded slowly, waiting. I could see the tension gather in his shoulders, like a storm cloud. This wasn't a casual conversation, and he knew it. Something about my voice, calm, unwavering, told him that whatever was coming wasn't small. I stood up, walked over to the sideboard, and pulled out the envelope, the one with my mother's handwriting. I placed it gently in front of him, like I was handing over something sacred. Read it, I said. He looked down at it, then up at me. Dalia, read it. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers. I watched his eyes scan the letter, his jaw clenched, his breath caught. I recognized the look in his eyes. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. When he finally looked at me, he didn't ask where I'd found it. He didn't ask how long I had known, because he knew this moment had been coming for years, maybe decades. I wanted to tell you, he said, voice low. I shook my head. But you didn't. Silence. I told you about my mother when we got engaged, I said. I told you how she died when I was little, how I didn't remember much. You knew, and you kept that from me. His eyes welled up, but I didn't flinch. You knew who I was before I even knew myself, and you let me build a life on lies. It wasn't lies, he whispered. It was protection. That word, protection, hit me like a slap. No, I said, standing straighter. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself from guilt, from shame, from whatever that letter made you feel, and you buried it, just like you buried me. His lip quivered. Dalia, I loved you. Maybe, I said. But you loved me in silence, in shadows. You loved me in the way someone clutches a secret, tight and terrified, and I'm done living like a secret. He looked down again, folded the letter slowly. His hands were shaking. I remember her, he said suddenly. Your mother, Sarah, I didn't know she was pregnant, not until that letter. I didn't know what to do. By then, she was gone, And when you told me your name had once been Sarah Lynn Whitmore, I put it together, but I didn't know how to tell you. You had years, I said quietly. You had decades. He nodded, eyes rimmed red. I was afraid you'd hate me. I let out a breath, not a sigh, but something deeper, the kind of breath you exhale when you finally let go of a weight that never belonged to you. I don't hate you, Gerald, I said. But I don't belong to you either, not anymore. He stared at me, eyes wide. For once, no arguments, no defenses, just silence. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my journal, not the whole thing, just a few pages I had copied by hand. My words, my truth. I slid them across the table next to the letter. I want you to read this, I said. Not to change your mind, but so you understand what it's like to live next to someone who knows your deepest truth and still lets you feel invisible. He didn't move. I stepped back. I'm going to Lena's for a few days. I've already packed. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I'm not running, I added. I'm reclaiming. I walked out the door with my bag, my journal, and the letter that had rewritten my entire life. I didn't slam it. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. Because I wasn't the same woman who used to wait for love in silence. I was the woman who had finally spoken. And now he had no choice but to hear me. Lena's house was warm and chaotic in the best way. She lived in a little craftsman home nestled between two maple trees, with sun-drenched windows, overgrown ivy on the fence, and a front porch that always smelled faintly of rosemary and laundry detergent. She welcomed me with open arms, no questions asked, just a long hug that I didn't know I needed until I melted into it. Stay as long as you want, Mom, she said, squeezing my hand. Seriously, I'll make up the guest room, and I mean it. No cleaning, no fussing, just rest. I nodded, unable to speak. My voice felt stuck behind a wall of emotion I hadn't sorted through yet. I had told her only part of the truth, that I needed space, that something in my marriage had changed, that I was figuring out who I was again. She didn't pry. She just made tea and let me be quiet. Those first 2 days at her place were strange, calming, yes, but also disorienting. I wasn't used to being cared for. I wasn't used to someone asking how I was and actually listening. We stayed up late watching old movies, and she told me stories about her job, her friends, the little things I'd missed. And slowly, I felt myself breathing again, really breathing, the kind that fills your lungs like wind through open curtains. On the 3rd day, Lena came into the living room with a puzzled look on her face. She was holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said. No return address. I took it slowly. My hands already knew what it was. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The letter was in Gerald's handwriting, uneven, shaky. Just seeing his name at the bottom made my heart skip, not out of longing, out of fear that he might try to pull me back. But it wasn't what I expected. The letter was an apology, not a vague, half-hearted one. A real one, the kind that strips a person bare. He admitted everything. The guilt that had eaten at him since the day he received that letter from my mother, how he carried it like a stone in his chest, how he convinced himself that if he never acknowledged it, it would fade, how marrying me was, in his words, an attempt to fulfill a duty that turned into something more complicated and more painful than he could ever explain. He wrote that he had always loved me, but not in the way I needed, and that he had failed me, not just as a husband, but as someone who owed me the truth. But what brought me to tears wasn't his words, it was the photograph. It was a picture of my childhood home, the one I hadn't visited in years. He had gone there the night of my birthday, and he had left a painting on the front step, one of my paintings, the one I had painted from memory of a little girl sitting on a red swing beneath a golden maple tree, looking off into the distance. He had framed it. He had written a note on the back of the canvas. For Sarah Lynn Whitmore, you were never invisible. I stared at the photo for a long time. Lena sat beside me, gently resting her head on my shoulder. I don't know what he's trying to do, I whispered. He's trying to give you something he never did before, she said softly. A real goodbye. And that's what it felt like. Not a plea for reconciliation, not an attempt to win me back, but a surrender, a gesture of justice. Quiet, poetic, and long overdue. He didn't need me to respond, and I wouldn't, not with words. Instead, I made a choice. I went back to that house, my childhood home, 2 days later. The painting was gone, but the front porch still looked the same. I stood there for a long time, holding a small envelope of my own. Inside it was a copy of my favorite journal entry, the one I had written the day after I found my mother's letter, the one that ended with the words, "I am not the sum of what was withheld from me. I am what I choose to reclaim." I slid it through the mail slot. No address, no name, just truth passed from one broken heart to another. That was my final justice. Not revenge, not rage, just the quiet power of a woman who finally saw herself and refused to ever disappear again. A week after I returned to Lena's house from visiting my old home, I was sitting on her porch with a sketch pad on my knees and the sun warming my shoulders when Max called. It had been weeks since I'd heard his voice. He wasn't the type to call without a reason, and rarely just to check in. But something about the tone in his message earlier, the hesitation, the soft edge in his voice, told me this wasn't one of those typical practical catch-up calls. I picked up. "Hi, Mom." Max." There was a pause. I could hear birdsong in the background, maybe from his backyard. "Are you okay?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but coming from Max, it felt loaded with unspoken things. I could tell he was trying to feel his way through something deeper. I honestly stated, "I'm doing better," adding, "Still figuring things out, but better." One more pause. "Dad told me," he stated, "about the letter, about everything." I remained silent. I let him go on. "He came over, not to make excuses, just to talk," he whispered. "I don't think I've ever seen him like that, not in my whole life." After inhaling deeply, I said, "He's good at hiding things, even from himself." Max said, "He said you left because it was time, not because he was angry." That's true. He remained silent for a while, and I could feel him processing the implications of everything, not just about his father, but also about his parents, his early years, and the secure, complete existence we had portrayed to him. At last, he remarked, "I didn't know you had another name, Sarah Lynn." "It was who I was before I became Dahlia Harper," I told him. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I saw a breeze blowing through the trees while Lena's neighbor watered her hydrangeas across the street. "Because I spent most of my life trying to become the kind of woman who didn't need the past to define her," I said. "But now I know I don't have to choose, I can be both."